Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
The Daily Rumble, the Daily Show. Welcome in. Dave Trafford here. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, and this will be show 9 so far in the campaign. 9 of 24. So we're making our way through it, heading towards the day after the election here in Ontario, which is, of course, February the 27th. And again, we said off the top, and we started this whole project when the writ was dropped, this is an election about something. It wasn't the Seinfeld election, and every day there's something new to deal with for a whole bunch of reasons. So let's get at it and welcome in Laura Babcock. She is here from Power Group Communications and host of the wildly popular O Show, and you can check that out on her YouTube channel. John Wright is here, of course, our founding resident pollster, and it's good to welcome back Gerard Kennedy, former federal MP, provincial MPP, ran the food bank when it was just one of those temporary things we thought we would just need to get us through the bump in the recession back in the late 80s and the 90s. So welcome in all. And by the way, I just want to, I get asked every once in a while, if anybody can identify the Queen's voice off the top there, who says, once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses. Just send me who you think that is. I'll be curious to hear what you guys hear. Okay, let's start with what's going on here in Toronto today. It's not necessarily on the provincial campaign trail or anything else, but of course, everything that's being talked about federally is affecting what's going on provincially. The Prime Minister is in Toronto today. He is hosting the Canada-US Economic Summit, and basically this is his push.
I think the strategic reflection we have to have right now is that we are in a moment that we have to meet for Canadians to see not just how we get through this particular challenge over the next 30 days or few months, but how we get through and thrive and grow stronger over the next 4 years and into what may be a more challenging long-term political situation with the United States. How do we make sure we are resilient as an economy? And for me, there's 3 areas we need to think about: Canada, the United States, and international. First of all, on Canada, it's about time we had genuine free trade within Canada.
John Wright, I think this is, if nothing else, is more of the awakening that is in the following. Not necessarily the reckoning following the tariff threat. You and I and Kathleen Wynne and Tim Hudak were talking about this maybe a month or so ago, and I suggested, hey, maybe interprovincial trade barriers would be a good thing to look at. Kathleen Wynne thought, well, that's not good enough to put in the window for Donald Trump. Great, but I'm glad to see it's front and center right now, at least in a serious way in terms of conversation.
Yeah, good to see that it's front and center, and particularly, a boost given by the Prime Minister, who clearly is looking for some legacy push here. I mean, if it hadn't been for his fight, the Liberals wouldn't necessarily be up as they are now across the country. The Conservatives are still leading in the polls, but it's got a balance going. He's also got a theme where he's doing things, let alone, visiting Europe and international leaders to talk about in tariffs and international trade and defense policy. So it's given him, some life. I don't know whether or not that's going to follow through very much, but it certainly is getting the audience focused on what needs to be done. And that is, we have to look after ourselves. The United States is clearly, from the Trump office, looking at not just these trade issues, but actually, even confirmed in the last few hours, looking at annexing Canada. I can't believe, we're still on that, but it is something that's going to continue over the next number of weeks. And the Prime Minister is using it as much as he can leading up to the Liberal convention.
Yeah, Laura, I don't know that it's, in the past, it might have been one of these things where we're hand wringing and so on. And everybody has stood up in the last 3 or 4 weeks and said, well, what are they doing? Do they have a plan? Do they have a plan? And as complicated as it is, as well as anybody, you just can't flip the switch and say, we got the plan. Here's the answer. But to me, there is a sense of direction. There's a sense that there's a path to be taken here. And I think he's also playing on this groundswell of Canadian reaction to the tariffs, to the annexation. And, Donald Trump has managed to do two things in the last week: unify Canada and unify the Middle East. So there's some positive there. But I think the Prime Minister's playing that wave.
Well, a common enemy unites, right? So Canadians are absolutely united. Unfortunately, Trump and his regime have become an enemy. The American people are not an enemy of Canada. They are our biggest trading partner. They are our friends and our family and our neighbors. But Trump and his threats and the Prime Minister confirming that he's not kidding. It's something that I've unfortunately been saying for months now. He's not kidding. He wants our resources. He wants what he wants. And as a bully and a dictator, he thinks he can get it, and he's going to try. So what does that mean for Canada? Well, I was delighted to see not only that, Trudeau is finally talking about some strategic positioning for our country and our economy. How do we diversify against the competition? Well, we obviously do that by making Canada more free trade between our borders, no more internecine provincial barriers, and also by working multilaterally. And that's what we're hearing out of Trudeau, but we're hearing it even more clearly out of Mark Carney. Mark Carney summed it up yesterday as saying, we can't have 13 economies in Canada, we have to have one. And I thought that was a really good way of framing it. Easy to understand how we've been operating to this point. Also, Carney did a presser today, I saw just before we got on, where he very clearly talked about the Canadian moment and that this is where we move from here. A very powerful message, one that will have Canadians backing him. And when he becomes the Prime Minister for however long on March 9th, we're already seeing, John talked about how the Liberals are seeing a bump in the polls. A poll just came out from Nanos that has Carney at 40% to Poilievre at 26% based on who would be best to fight Trump. And let's face it, guys, this is not going to be an election at any point in the next year about carbon tax or any singular policy economically. This is going to be about Canada's strategic positioning in the world and against the United States to protect our economy and our sovereignty. And Mark Carney's got that. And so I think that this is going to be very, very different game for the Liberals federally. No doubt about it.
Well, Gerard, you've sat in the chair in Queen's Park. You've sat in the chair in Parliament Hill, and are just the general public. I don't think a lot of people realize, first of all, that there are the trade barriers. Second is that anytime anybody brings it up, we've been talking about this for the last 25 years, and it never gets even on the table for serious discussion. Is this a change? I mean, a legitimate change in terms of the tone?
Well, I think it's always going to be the path of least resistance, and I think that I was not a big fan of the free trade deal back in the 80s, simply because it makes us lazy and makes our businesses lazy, and we get a little more prone to being the spin-off shop of the American outfits. And so this is harder, but way more necessary for us to do. But also, speaking as somebody born in Western Canada, it's not just as simple as letting all the Ontario enterprises take over the markets in the rest of the country. It's almost, something that does need to get worked out. But I'd also like to say something, just maybe a little reaction to what John was saying. I don't think Justin Trudeau's worried too much about the politics of things. I think him and others out there, they actually get elected to do things, to do useful things. And I think part of the reason that people are a little bit galvanized is because there's Mr. Trudeau, there's a number of his ministers not really looking for the glory and working pretty hard. I'm not sure we deserve that dedication, but it's worth remarking on that not all politicians are always angling. I know we're talking about an election and everybody's asking for our support, but it's what they do the rest of the time, folks, is they try and do something useful. There is not actually enough glory for the rest of it. And I'm not saying there should be a general apologist thing there, but the idea that everything is a political calculus, I'm sorry, is wrong. And also that it's all up to the politicians. It isn't. And if Mr. Carney's talking about a moment, it's a moment because Canadians are prepared to stop watching. You know how adroit everybody's getting at choosing Canadian products? It's what everybody's talking about. Like, is it made in Canada? If it's made in Canada, is it a product of Canada? How does that work? Is it really going to make a difference? Do they pay people properly? So, that's economics. And the public interest has never been just what the government chooses to do. So I think that's, to me, fairly critical. The government is following in a sense, but in other ways, opening doors. And that's what government should do. And if I was ever critical of my former colleagues in the Trudeau government, it's simply that they didn't ask enough of the rest of the country. They never put any hard things on the table. They've got 13 or 14 or 15 free trade deals. Would you even know about it? That they've gone off and signed them, and that we could possibly be now depending on those pathways to business. If some of our businesses want to step up and diversify markets, there's something in the Globe and Mail today that said 87% of Canadian businesses are trading with one partner. Chances are it's to the south, it's right there, it's simple, it's the same language, you don't have to adapt very much. So I think a consumer-driven and citizen-driven kind of interest hopefully will translate. It could burn out, it could go away, but Trump is there for 4 years. I think that's absolutely true. I think this is something that is not just a moment. I think it's an inflection that could get people to drive forward. And I do want to tip my hat to Mr. Trudeau and the others that are going to carry it for a little bit, and then we'll see if it's Mr. Carney or others to carry it forward. But if the rest of us check out and say, oh, this looks too hard, we don't want to talk to Newfoundland about how they can keep some employment there, we don't want to work it out, we don't want to talk about a pipeline. I'm not that keen on oil, but it is slightly insane that we cannot use what we're still pumping out, still selling to the Americans at a discount. And then we pay more for bringing in oil, sometimes from countries with really poor human rights records and everything, and put it in our tanks here. Like, there's got to be, if we're a country, there's got to be some way to work that through. Some of it will depend on Quebec and Ontario, finding a way, and whether the cost benefit works for the lifetime of how we want to be using oil. But those are the big tests of whether this means something.
Well, John, the Prime Minister even pointed out, in those brief remarks, he's not just talking about 4 years. He's talking about, galvanizing our economy against future issues down the road. And I think that's a wise consideration. To Gerard's point, I'm not sure why it's taken this long to get us to that point, but I'm glad we're here.
Yeah, I am too. Except, pardon me for being cynical about all of this stuff. Let me just say a few things. Number one. You know what? I was at Metro, at the Metro grocery store yesterday for the second day in a row, because what I was doing was collecting as many different Canadian coffee output as I could. And it looked like a game show in our kitchen where they were all lined up, and I was trying all the pods and all the stuff. And I must say that the closest to Verona Starbucks that we've had in this house for the last decade or more is actually Kicking Horse 454 horsepower. So guess what? The percolator's being there. We've got it. It's happening. So, there's a tangible thing when you walk down the aisles and you see people with their iPhones and they're looking at products and they're doing these sort of things. So yes, there's a groundswell. Number two, I have to again look at the Prime Minister and say, this is a great boost. Talking about all of this sort of stuff is fantastic. I don't know, as I said at the outset of this, I don't know where it's going to go, because it really does depend on the provinces. So while we all may sing kumbaya and say that we're all going to do these things, it wasn't any more than an hour after, some of the tariff issues started to come forward that the Bloc Québécois and the Premier of Quebec said, no oil coming through this place, absolutely not socially acceptable. And we've yet to have the premiers who actually control the interborder trade sit down and have some kind of discussion on it. So the Prime Minister can talk about this all he wants, but it's going to end up being about a provincial circumstance to be changed. Number three, you know what? Things have changed politically in the last period of time, but let's keep in mind that it has to do with ever since the Prime Minister decided to leave. A week before he did, they were sitting at, the Liberals federally were sitting between 16 and 18% in the polls. He'd been knifed in the front by his finance minister. He'd had a caucus revolt in many ways to get rid of him. And if anything, people were talking about a party which was going to be, decimated to the size of a small bus in terms of the members it elected in Parliament. There's been a revival. It's not just on the tariff issue. It's not just on Mark Carney, but in the polling that I'd done, in November, we saw in 4 major cities across this country that 30% of the vote in each one of those cities had turned against the prime minister, but were willing to look again. And if we have to bring it back to Ontario, we can see now in the Toronto area, the Liberals up actually 7 points. They're heading northbound as a bit of a bounce for the Liberals overall. So when I said at the outset that this is a prime minister who is looking at his legacy, it's a hell of a lot better to have a legacy for fighting as Captain Canada and going out and doing something so that you can step on the stage or whatever place it's going to be, so that the new incoming prime minister's got some runway. But you can actually say, hey, look what we've done in the last couple of months. So I echo only the one thing that you said, Dave, is I don't know why it took so long to get here. I mean, interprovincial trade has been an issue for as long as I've been alive, and we haven't done much about it. But here we are, and the numbers for the Liberals, both federally and provincially, are improving a little bit.
Well, and you pointed out, Laura, the shift in the federal campaign. I mean, the axe the tax thing was has been dead in the water for quite a while, given the tariff threats, and the conversation provincially. But there's also some word that the Tories federally now are getting off of that label. They want to get away from the axe the tax, but they want to put, capitalize on this Canada first idea that we're all Canadians first and we're going to do our thing to support local manufacturing and et cetera. So it's an interesting dynamic there, because when we look at that ballot question has shifted. And as soon as that happens, things are in play.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of problems with what Poilievre has done. One is that he singularly focused all of the ire on the brand of Trudeau the man, hence the F Trudeau flags we've all had to suffer through. I saw it in the drive-through the other day, and I'm like, did you not get the news? Trudeau's leaving, right? But that wasn't about the Liberals as much. And so what happens now is that Canadians are like, okay, yeah, Trudeau's gone. Good. So now who's up on stage? Oh, a world-renowned economist who helped us not get into the underwater mortgage scandal that hit the economy in 2008. I mean, that guy, Mark Carney, that competent individual. We have an opportunity to have that person maybe weigh in on how to deal with the existential threat to our country, which is economic force coming from the U.S. So I think Canadians are like, I was getting tired of the Liberal brand, but mostly Trudeau's been the problem. That's what Poilievre has been saying for years. It's Trudeau. So Trudeau's gone. Now who's on the deck? Who's coming up to the plate? And you got to look at the batting average of a Mark Carney over a career politician like Poilievre and say, you'd have to be crazy not to go for Mark Carney in this moment. So politics is also about timing. The timing of the tariffs. It's not just about tariffs, which I think Ford made a mistake just making it all about the tariffs, because Trump took that off the table. And now Ford's campaign is scrambling in Ontario a little bit. And so it's about what is it to be Canadian? What is it to survive with our liberal democracy? And I mean liberal with a small L. What is it to differentiate strategically from the US? And so if Poilievre thinks that making a pivot to Canada first, when Canadians every morning are waking up to the alarming reality of what America first means in terms of nativism, and they see that echoed in Canada, I don't think that plays the way that they want it to. I think Canadians look at that and says, that sounds a lot like Maple MAGA to me. That sounds like Trump. That does not sound like a strong Canadian economy, independent and multilateral in terms of our relationships globally. I think Canadians are saying, don't say or do anything that sounds like what's coming out of the US right now. We don't like the US right now. I mean, I was at the LCBO and there were red marker X's on all the American products. It doesn't get more aggressive than I've never seen that in all my years of teaching marketing and communications. I've never seen such a bold repudiation of a product visually. So Canadians are seeing red X's on American products. They're seeing Trump with all of his bullying of the world and saying, anything that sounds like Trump is going to be a non-starter in this country. So I think Poilievre is panicking. I think I said that a few weeks ago, and I think it's more so now with these new poll numbers. How do you pivot when all you've done is put out simple slogans to complex problems, right? And vilified and demonized a single individual who's no longer part of the conversation. So I think they're in trouble. And as I said, I think Ford provincially still probably going to get a majority, but I think he's been hurt by his adjacency with Elon Musk and the Starlink deal. It was a really bad look, his flip-flop the other day, and then being on tape once again saying how much he wanted Trump to win. These are not good looks when the entire country is looking at the US as a singular opponent.
Gerard, last time we talked, you had suggested that you're sensing this sort of groundswell of concern around, voters, typically here in Ontario, vis-a-vis the Ontario election. But that was against the threat of tariffs from Trump. Now that has been mitigated or delayed somewhat, and we seem to have regrouped. Has your sense of that groundswell of concern shifted at all in the last 10, 12 days?
I think I know not really in the sense of this, and again, I don't want to just keep going back and forth with John, but the fact is that what the public is thinking today is one thing, and picked up in a poll. But the question is, if people are feeling what they were feeling before, did Justin Trudeau, to bring him back in, deserve to be at 16%? Probably not. But he's kind of drawing off a lot of the poisons. The useful thing happens in democracy is that we can take it out on a leader or a party and move on. But I think when people are being thoughtful, when they're forced to be thoughtful, I think that doesn't go away right away. And the fact that people are, whether they're Xing the products with red X's or whether they're shopping for something or whether they're thinking about shopping, like it's a transference. Like before, I think a lot of the poison in the environment was the fear that we got from the pandemic. I don't think our politicians addressed that directly. I don't think they apologized enough for the things that were mistakes. I don't think we understand how we'll deal with the next sort of thing coming at us. And I think that was a big mistake on people's parts. And I happen to know, because I was in a position to know, that there were some big mistakes made, and some of them by Mr. Ford. I don't know if they'll make their way into this election in terms of the kind of protections we didn't have that we could have had. But I think it's more about the mood of the electorate. They're not just going to trust elections to just happen. And that's not great if that does transfer fully. I'm not sure it has into the Ontario election. Mr. Ford has been very cynical. I hope he pays a price just for that. He wants to do a winter election, bad weather, people won't show up, people will be diverted. He'll jump on the right side of the tariff thing, and he won't actually be asked to account for the last 3 years or his early election. If people stay plugged in, if people know that they got to be paying attention, that's already bad for him. That people will see and remember that little, snippet of him saying 100% he's behind Mr. Trump, that he wanted him to be elected. Pretty tough to be doing that and be Captain Canada at the same time. But beyond that, I think people will be looking for something more than he was prepared to offer. Now, Ms. Crombie is going to have to provide it, or Ms. Stiles, or, somebody is going to have to put something else on the table and get this thinking to go. So I do think it matters. I think all of us, whenever we run for office, we hope we can get people to pay attention. I was just talking to the Liberal candidate in the riding up here in New York Southwest, and Daniel DeGiorgio, and talking about my by-election when I got elected in this riding, and we got a 38% turnout. Well, prior to that, there hadn't been anything that cracked 30% for quite a while. People paying attention makes an enormous difference. I was lucky to beat David Miller and Rob Davis, both very formidable candidates in their own rights, and as a rookie coming in. But part of it was that voter turnout. It was getting people to vote, to come out, and there's a whole bunch of that there. People don't feel very welcome in the political process, except right now they think they need to be. They need to know something more than they knew before.
Yeah, John, is your Metro grocery experience kind of one of those things that we can translate to motivating people to get out and actually pay attention, first to campaigns, and second to vote where they may not have otherwise?
Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm that's been shared here. On the other hand, I want to kind of look at the latest numbers, because that's kind of what I do. And let's agree that Nick Nanos's polls, which is rolling on a nightly basis, is a credible source for all of that. So despite everything that we've just said, the Tories, the Ford Tories, are sitting province wide at 46%, the Liberals at 30%, the NDP at 16%, which gives, the four Tories a 16-point advantage over the Liberals and a 20-point advantage over the NDP. You swing down into the GTA, and you've got Ford at 49%, the Liberals at 35%, and the NDP at 12%. And then, inside of Toronto, the Liberals and the Tories are tied. So, what I think we go back to where we were a week ago. And when the four of us talked about this, and we knew that the tariff issue was underway with inside the campaign, and we said, wonder how long that's going to take until people become fatigued with it all. And the issue really is today, what are the Tories campaigning on? So while Merritt Stiles and the NDP and Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals are talking about healthcare in the last 24 hours, there's Mr. Ford again moving the goalpost to a new terrain, and that is talking about affordability, talking about gridlock in the GTA, talking about infrastructure spending around transportation, saying that he's going to make the gas tax that he's eliminated, make it permanent, talking about wallet issues. So, the question that we had last week, how long would they hang on to this about tariffs, and did they have the plan B to start to surface? We're now seeing that. So again, while it's a very smart agenda, they're zeroing in on the GTA where they can get those votes, and they need those votes. And in fact, they may be responding to what they're seeing in the polls with the Liberals bouncing a little bit. But the other two parties are simply not getting the traction nor the awareness that they need to have in order to make it in the polls.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that, because yesterday when he was Premier Ford, that is, was on his campaign stop, it sort of came out of the blue around this discussion about the Midtown GO train line that they were going to resurrect. And it's not a new idea, but it was one that was pushed out yesterday and kind of was just dropped into the middle of his campaign
Are
stop.
you actually promising to build this new Midtown line and this Bolton line at this point?
Absolutely, we are. We're going to make sure we have the designs moving forward, engineering. I wish I could just snap my fingers, happen overnight. But again, we're working collaboratively. I believe it's a CN line, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure. But every line that we do, it's their track. So we're going to have to work with them.
And Laura, the thing that strikes me about that answer is that typically Doug Ford would know the file well enough to know whether or not it was a CN line. So this seemed to be they called an audible here, and it got thrown into it. And then you combine that with the just an hour or so ago, confirming that the 401 Express tunnel is going to now be part of the platform and the promise of this campaign. It's also worth noting that none of this has been costed. So for all of the bitching and complaining about Crombie not costing out the ODSP or whatever it happened to be, and I'm not suggesting they shouldn't, but it cuts both ways.
Yeah, so it's laughable. I mean, he also promised to get the Eglinton Crosstown finally done this year. I mean, whatever. He has not been able to meet his own housing targets, his own transit targets. And I know he was making the whole mandate for this election, the whole reason for this cynical, short winter election, the shortest month of the year, least amount of advanced polling days or voting days for all the people who are traveling. I mean, it's a brutal, cynical move. It'll probably pay off, but it's not because Ontarians are buying what they're hearing from Doug Ford. He could not get the mandate for the tariffs because Trump took that off the table. So now he's saying, oh, well, I need a mandate now. I need hundreds of billions of dollars to spend on a tunnel under the 401 that nobody asked for, hasn't been properly costed. It's been estimated 500 million or 500 million billion, whatever. It's a ton of money. Someone slid a idea over to him, and he's like, oh yeah, we should do that. It sounds about as credible as what he's talking about a project where he doesn't even know who owns the rail line. And if you listen to his tone, this is not the bombastic guy who started the campaign. This is not that. This is a guy who's walking away from media questions in an election campaign that he asked for, and he won't even take all the questions. He doesn't have what sounds like even solid plans around new expenditures. He has wasted our money on a 95-year secret deal with an Austrian spot Ontario place where he's paying $500 million just for a parking lot and ridiculous other things that Ontarians are getting no transparency on, and the Auditor General called them out on. He canceled the Service Ontario locations for Ontario's small businesses, lost Canadian jobs to benefit an American hedge fund. And he's in this Starlink deal with Elon Musk. The only time he looked like he actually got his Captain Canada gig for real was when he said, no, got to cancel this deal with Elon. And then that afternoon, after Trump canceled the tariffs or paused them like a sort of Damocles over our country, what does Ford do? Jumps right back into the Starlink deal where he was grossly overpaying Elon Musk and Trump. So, I mean, Ontarians who are paying attention are going, this is enough of this nonsense. And there is an anti-incumbency movement around the world. And this is the first time that that may affect Ford in an election. We'll have to see. But the reality is, for the last couple of years, the Ontario Liberals and the NDP have not done enough to hold his feet to the fire. They've not done enough to fundraise effectively and to galvanize their parties to mission. And they are being well outspent. Like I think Ford, I had on actually Gerard Kennedy's successor, I believe, on the O Show yesterday. And she was talking brilliantly about the fact that, you know, the Conservatives have more money than both parties put together now, and that they are going to be, you know, out buying this election for all of the rest of the parties combined. So of course they have an advantage. Of course their poll numbers are up. They have yet to be really challenged. I think though that Bonnie, Crombie and the Liberals are getting a little momentum. They're getting a little mojo. They're talking about healthcare and the fact that millions of Ontario people don't have a doctor in this province. That's insane in one of the countries in the G7 nations. I mean, so Ford has failed on healthcare. He's failed on transit. He's failed on his own housing targets. There are lots of reasons that Sherry DeNovo pointed out on the O Show with me that, you know, if you're upset about not being able to get an apartment you can afford, that's on Ford. If you're upset about these other things, that's on Ford. Now, will the opposition parties hold his feet to account as well as Sherry did on the O Show, or I might be doing here, or others might be doing? I don't know. They don't have a lot of time left. There's literally weeks before February 27th. But I do think it would be foolish to underestimate how much trust has been lost with Ford, how angry people are at Donald Trump right now. And every time that Ford looks adjacent to the Trump regime or to Elon Musk, it's one more feeling of ick for people in Ontario. And as Gerard said, if people in Ontario are actually focused now, like actually in the game, like politics is not that thing they avoid as much as they can. They actually care now because they're fighting for their sense of being a Canadian. Some of that acid splash hits the Ford campaign. There's no way it doesn't. So I think that has to be factored in. Tariffs are off the table. There's no reason for this election now. And Doug Ford is a fan of the very regime that is threatening our country. I mean, how does he square that? I don't think he can.
Well, let's look at the other numbers though. And John, this has popped up obviously vis-a-vis the polling. It's hard to deny that trend. It's going to be a long, hard row to hoe for any of the opposition to make gains on that huge lead. You know, going from 20 to 16 probably might be as good as it gets in the short term. But the other part of that question is, who do Ontarians think is best equipped to handle what Trump's doing or what's going on in the province? The premier still runs away with that number too. So there's an overwhelming number of Ontarians who think, yeah, well, I'm probably okay with, given everything Laura just said, I'm okay with Doug Ford being the premier of the province.
Well, listen, I think we're not just talking to each other, we're talking to people out there. And I think the fact is that, you know, politics and democracy are too important to leave to the politicians. If you feel that, you know, the pandemic made you extra anxious and worried, if you think that what's going on down south never could have happened, you can't afford to just let this be a moment or a spark. You actually have to look at, why is Mr. Ford allowing all those ads you see? American companies walked away with $2 billion worth of profits on their gambling. Why would we let that happen? And the province's take was $40 million. How many times is Mr. Ford going to get away with enriching other people? And you know, like, in other words, if you're not going to have debates provincially, if you're not going to have debates in your local campaign, and every person listening thinks that's okay, then we're going to get a Trumpish kind of outcome here. That's how it gets done. if you look at what happened in the United States, the people who didn't vote are the ones who brought in Mr. Trump. The people who stayed home because they were too ticked off and too tired and too busy overpaying for things and putting up with stuff, the same way a lot of people here feel. There has to be a rebound on that. We only get good when people get good and involved. And that's what does need to happen. I don't think it's automatic. I don't think we can read that in the tea leaves right now. But, you know, some of that's going to depend on the energy of some of those candidates out there. It's going to depend on whatever's left of an air war. Unfortunately, the journalism is not as much of a wavelength, and we need, and people are now using algorithms and other ways to tell us how to think. There is something in seriousness. So there's a seriousness now. We don't want to be part of the United States. We don't want to fall into that. We don't want to be, you know, have our democracy dictated by Mr. Trump or anyone else. And Mr. Ford needs to answer some questions. He's called an election. He's been the premier. He's got, you know, less money in the schools. He's got kids in those schools struggling like crazy. You know, the kids in grade 1, their learning is negative to where it was by about 25%. Who's helping them with $1,500 less per student? He wants to wave stuff in the direction of beer and underground tunnels. How about running the province properly? Whose side is Mr. Ford on is what people have to ask themselves. So I don't want to do it as wholesale. Frankly, Laura's taking care of that really well to say what, you know, Mr. Ford isn't, but I just want people to ask the questions. I think that that's how we get better government. And, you know, John, I saw his face a little bit there with Laura was saying some things, and I don't mean that I'm a John expression reader, but, you know, it is not unfair to believe that people can step forward at all. And it is not just based on their self-interest. If somebody doesn't call people in to do something, and I hope that the opposition leaders will do that. I think they recognize that there's something more going on here. I've seen elections do that in the past. I'd have I really think there will be some things about this we cannot predict today. It will not just be a straight line trend. But, you know, that will depend on the people listening, not on us.
John?
I have a resting cynic face. Sorry. Yeah,
it was twitching a bit there. I wasn't.
You triggered him, pal.
As I said, I appreciate the enthusiasm. I want to put it also in perspective, just looking at the polling numbers and everything else. And I would agree that campaigns matter. And we still have 3 weeks to go, or whatever the length of time is. There still is time for things to change. And so anything can happen, yes. But we started out this campaign with an average of about 44% voting for Mr. Ford, and the Conservatives were now sitting at about 46%. So it's not like they're going backwards. The Liberals, as I said, have bounced up a little bit, primarily in Toronto, but not much else anywhere else. To put it in a political election perspective, Mr. Ford's getting higher numbers than Mike Harris did in the 1995 campaign. Like, he's got 2 points higher than where we are, and that delivered the common sense revolution across the province. So I don't want to dampen the enthusiasm for anybody who's partisan out there, and go out there and get your vote out and do what you got to do for democracy. But the reality is that the numbers don't speak to that enthusiasm that we're talking about. So, you know, let's come back a week from now and let's see where things are. We did say, though, that.
But John, can I just inject that it was, and please hold that thought, but it was Lynn McLeod that was leading the polls when that campaign started.
Yeah, I'm putting it in perspective just in terms of how big it was at that time and how it ended. Yeah. And, you know, I remember the day when it was shout at your spouse, lose your house on the front page of the Toronto Sun. So I get all of that. But that is the reality of, you know, from the size of where they are right now to where the Liberals have to catch up. It's 16 points in the poll. So I think if they're going to make any inroads, the Liberals have got to come home to the urban areas. I mean, you can't just be the single note through the entire campaign about healthcare. Like, you can't keep changing the bus to these many people died, to these many people have no doctor, to these many people are backed up in emergency rooms. Like, you gotta be more than that to win an election campaign. And I think that's where the Tories, understanding that they've got different arrows that they've got to pull out for the campaign have moved from just strictly, we've got to be Captain Canada, we're going to fight with everything we can to support everybody. When the tariff issue has gone away for a little bit, out comes the affordability issue, out comes the GTA issue, out comes the transit issue. So again, we still have time to go in the campaign, but I don't see the other two parties rising to the occasion yet. Like I honestly don't. Now, what you may be saying is absolutely true. On the other hand, I don't hear it from the other parties, and they're not having the breakthrough that they really need to do in order to get some traction.
Well, let me suggest that after our conversation yesterday, where it sounded like, and at every turn, and it wasn't that we were picking on the Liberals, that was just the self-inflicted wounds over the last few days in terms of the campaign. And John, you and John Tory talked about, how Bonnie Crombie needs to sort of ignite the campaign. I think yesterday she might have had the best 45 seconds so far on this campaign by doing pretty much what you had suggested they needed to do out of the gate.
Doug Ford said he'd end hallway medicine. He didn't get it done. He said he'd cut your taxes. He didn't get it done. He said he'd build 1.5 million homes. He didn't get it done. And we will. And that's what formed the basis of our platform. Delivering a family doctor to you within 4 years. Cutting your taxes, small business taxes, family taxes, taking the HST off your home heating and your hydro, and having a plan to make life affordable, but also to build affordable homes. So this has been we knew that this would be the substance of our platform, but you're quite right. Now we have to cost it. It was an abrupt snap election call. It was an opportunistic call. He's trying to cling to power, and he seized what was happening in the US as an opportunity to do that.
Well, and I think you've talked about the slogan, rather than more for you. He didn't get it done is what kind of came through there, John. And I think that's a huge step up in terms of energy and presentation. Yeah,
we've talked about since the beginnings of this campaign about the execution of their campaign. Mm-hmm. And if you take a look, if you're listening on the radio, you couldn't see it, but if you look at the background of it, how it was staged, how she was motivated, how she was leaning into it, that is the clip where, in fact, all of a sudden, the Liberal campaign came together just in terms of visuals, in terms of sound and everything else. It's a rarity. The question is whether it's going to continue. The question is whether or not she's got enough oomph in particularly in the urban centers, whether it be in London, Toronto, or some of the other places in Ottawa. She's going to be able to do this. But that is the first time that we've actually seen and heard a viable Liberal Ontario campaign since it started at the outset.
Yeah, Laura, there was some energy in there that we haven't seen.
You know what, and have been screaming for ever since they put Del Duca up. I've been like, really? That's the best the Liberals got? So, I'm so happy to see what looks like a competent, well-articulated, efficient communication from somebody who would be the premier. And Bonnie proved in that clip that she can do it. The question becomes, can she build on that? Can she keep that rolling? We have seen other campaigns, guys. We don't even have to look too far back federally, where there was another person who was well in the lead. And then, things changed in the last few weeks. When people catch the fire behind a candidate, it can be really powerful. I'm not suggesting that Bonnie can pull a Sunny Ways out of her hat, but if there is the anti-incumbency feeling in elections, if in fact people are more afraid of Trump than they are fans of Ford and no longer see Ford as being the person who is going to stand up to Trump, but rather the guy who's quick to do deals with him, then I think that might give Bonnie the kind of wind behind her back that she needs. And it's not enthusiasm, John. You keep saying it's enthusiasm. What you're hearing from me is not enthusiasm. What you're hearing from me is a revulsion against the state of Ontario under this premier who's had 6 years of a majority, who has no reason for this election other than wanting to play tough against Trump and then couldn't do that, right? And so now we're looking at it going, you're spending $200 million of our money on a cynical election, opportunistic, as Bonnie said. We don't need to be going through this when we should be focusing everything we have on our economy, on housing, on transit, on municipalities, on healthcare, on education. And instead you're playing these political games. For what? Who are you profiting? who are you working for, Doug Ford? Because it ain't the people of Ontario. And we know that. So it's not about enthusiasm. It's going to be about anger and whether or not another candidate like Bonnie Crombie can get enough people to believe she's competent so that they park a protest vote to Ford. And in different ridings like mine, where the NDP is probably likely to win, strategic voting tools like votewell.ca tell me to vote NDP to stop the Conservatives. So if people really want to send a message to this premier, they may be able to hold him to a minority where he has to actually be accountable, where he actually has to price out these big plans instead of telling us he's going to spend $500 billion on a tunnel nobody asked for. He has to be held to account. The people of Ontario are people who make money and who have to pay for their families' bills and their mortgages and their groceries, and they do not want a premier who wantonly spends our money without accountability. I'm a business owner and I'm sick of it. I'm a mother and a business owner, and I am sick of paying for Doug Ford's projects that nobody asked for, that nobody even understands, that he hasn't even costed, and where he's done them, he's had overruns to the hundreds of millions of dollars, and who cancels a contract for beer and corner stores at the cost of $612 million of my money for no reason other than cynical political advantage. No, it's not enthusiasm you're hearing, John Wright. It's rage. And if people in Ontario think they can park some of that rage against Ford in a Liberal camp, because now the Liberals look like they have a good platform and they have some momentum, then we might see that change. I don't think, and I've never said that Doug Ford's going to lose, but I do think that he is at risk of people in Ontario telling him they really resent the way he's been leading our province with no accountability and with no results.
So what do you really think?
I'll tell you on the O Show. It's called The Opinion Show. And the Current Affairs Show with strong opinions. You can find it on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.
Well, you know, there may be rage in certain people's hearts at the moment, but I mean, in the campaign itself, we've still got a few weeks to go. I'm delighted to meet back next week to see if it's ignited a couple of points and see if the rocket's taking off. Right now, it's not there. And we'll have to see whether or not the Liberal Party and the NDP actually take advantage of that rage.
Well, Gerard, one of the lines I've heard this week is the only candidate that the Tories are worried about is the Premier himself. I mean, he's the one guy that they want to make sure kind of stays under wraps. I dare say, based on what we have seen from the Liberal campaign, Bonnie Crombie may be the same kind of character that the main character candidate, rather, that the Liberals are worried about, because we see a completely different candidate in that 50-second clip we just played than we have seen in the last week and a half.
Well, listen, I served with Bonnie Crombie when she was an MP in Ottawa. I mean, she's a very capable politician. I don't doubt, and I saw also a bit of an earlier signal in some of the ads that they did. Like she's coming from an immigrant family background. She's got Polish background from Parkdale High Park. People who are hard scrabble working their way up, and I think Mr. Ford is manipulating every which way he can. They took out a lot of ads beforehand. They allowed themselves the ability to use government ads in a way that would have been illegal if they'd waited for the proper election date. I think he's got to be a little bit worried about her getting unwrapped here, because I don't think you need a perfect candidate to start making Mr. Ford look a bit deficient. The bluster that was a bit charming before looks a little Trumpian today. But I do think, I can agree on this maybe with John, is that it is going to be the Liberals have got to show, look, he picked certain groups of people and he's continuing to do that. Like, you have to make the choice crisper and cleaner. If the school kids can't go to the science center anymore because Mr. Ford wants to instead give some offshore people building a spa a reason to have the science center down there, I mean, and on and on. There are so many examples. We do need some of that to be brought to us. I think that having people alert and interested and involved and pushing for something on part of their local campaigns matters. But I do think some of these issues that are manifest that Mr. Ford hopes there isn't enough time. John says, though, next week and the week after. Well, there's only 3 of those, and then there's an election. So I think I'm hoping people listening to this will do some extra effort on their own in terms of what they've been prepared to do. Show up at a meeting, listen to what's going on, pay more attention when you hear something that might call Mr. Ford to account, because he's trying to fool you. Just like Mr. Trump fooled people in the United States, he does not have a high regard for you out there. He thinks he can get away with this. He's using all the levers of government to do things that you don't approve of. He has not made himself accountable and said, how did I do these last 3 years? He simply said, I'm going to sneak in here. There's a big federal issue out there. He hasn't said one word about how he's going to protect people if jobs start to disappear, because he thinks the feds are going to step in just like they did during the COVID pandemic and pay for everything. He's got money in his treasury because the federal government made up all the difference when it came to extra monies for schools, for homeless shelters, for a range of things. So who is the real Mr. Ford is something, yes, the opposition has to make happen. But I think a lot of people, if they ask themselves, and I'm just saying, you owe it to yourselves to ask yourselves, whose side is Mr. Ford on? And I think that's something that people need to put the extra effort into, because if they don't, then they're basically saying, you know what, whatever we've got here, it's not worth any effort on my part. I can be manipulated. The algorithms can tell me what to do. We end up with a Ford, we end up with a Trump, I don't care. I think we're in that kind of zone, and I hope people take it to heart, not because I say so, because I think people have that little spidey sense going off. Something isn't right in the public realm right now, and I need to be more alert, more involved, more engaged. John will tell us whether it happens or not, but my sense, the public's always right, the voters are always right. I sense that there's something here that Mr. Ford can't control, can't manipulate, and that, more than just his personality, I think, is what his backroom guys have to look out for.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that. And because I as this goes on, we get into the final couple of weeks of the campaign. I want to see how, and we've all sort of touched on this, around the messaging is important. The platforms are important, or however they're going to present those things. But increasingly, it's the ad buy that's going to actually, I think, make a turn here, because clearly the media is asking the questions that Laura put in front of us, and Gerard has suggested we need to ask the premier. But, even yesterday when I asked about the Greenbelt scandal, I don't know anything about that. We're cooperating with the RCMP, and I haven't been questioned yet. It was a 27-second answer to that question around what was going on with the staffers at Queen's Park and the bribery allegations. So, to me, I think the twist here is going to go to how do they manage their ad campaign in the last 3 weeks. So maybe we'll get a sense of that the next time we four meet. Laura Babcock, thank you. Gerard Kennedy, always good to see you. And John Wright, come anytime. In fact, you do. He's here all the time. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. And we are doing it daily, Monday to Friday. And if you are otherwise listening on the radio at News Talk 1010, on a Saturday morning, we're on at 10 o'clock. Monday to Friday, it's 5 a.m. So again, not up that early. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, iHeart, etc. And if you've got questions or thoughts about what was said and you've got an idea, you want to contribute to the conversation, go to my website, davetrafford.com, and we have a talk back button there. Hit the button, leave the message, and we'll be happy to respond for sure. And if not, include your comments in an upcoming episode of the podcast. All right, that'll do it for us. Enjoy your Super Bowl weekend, and we'll talk to you again. We'll be back Monday with On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast from Story Studio.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.